As the title of this screencast leads you to believe, this is going to be a discussion about violent versus nonviolent protests. The colonists had every reason in the mid-17, even into the late 1700s, to be angry. They felt as if they'd been taken advantage of. They felt that they had been looked down upon, treated as second-class citizens, and most importantly, they felt they had no voice in the government. They had no means of countering some of the laws and the acts and certainly the taxes that had been bestowed upon them by powers that be. And those powers that be, of course, were the king and parliament. So the protests that we're going to talk about today are going to be broken into two different sections. The nonviolent protests versus the violent. And of course, the violent are the flashy ones. They're the ones that would receive front page positions in the newspapers. And they were the ones that people would talk about, and certainly the ones that we talk about today in textbooks. But it's the nonviolent protests and the nonviolent approaches that the colonists tried and in some cases succeeded, but in most cases felt that it wasn't enough. Sometimes a nonviolent protest can only go so far, and if the king or the leader or the whoever says so what to a petition or a boycott or an ignorance of sorts, then the next logical step is to go violent, and that's of course the way the colonists saw it. So you see up here in this little picture here, you see some protesters up there picketing. They look angry, but they're not doing anything violent or illegal. They're walking through the streets and they're stating their opinion. We don't like this. We don't like that. We still do this today. So let's talk. The first thing that I think about when I think about protests is going to be this picture right here. And again, this picture right here represents, it's a fairly common or famous picture, I guess, or rendition of a tar and feathering. And I'm going to point a couple things out in this picture that sort of represent a lot of what I would call violent protests. Obviously, from the picture, you can see that it is violent, and it is a duplicate. It's the same picture on both sides. It's not one of those pictures where I say, try to find what's different on the left than what's on the right. I'll leave that to your media awareness teachers. But if you look at this picture here, there's a couple of key components that I want to make sure you see or that you don't miss. Number one, there is a guy in the middle here. More likely than not, this is a tax collector. And he could be collecting tax for a variety of different things, from the sugar to the stamp, any of those Townsend Acts. But in this case, most likely he was collecting a tax on tea. How do we know that? Because what they're doing is they are pouring hot, scalding tea down this man's throat. So if it weren't bad enough that they boiled down tar and they poured it over his body and then threw feathers on him in sort of a mocking way, they're also going to pour scalding tea down this man's throat. And again, we'll discuss later whether tax collectors deserve this kind of treatment. The second thing, I guess, as I just pointed out, the hot scalding tea. Again, this is a representation of them saying, or I guess just the colonists saying, if you're going to tax us for our tea, take this. Take our tea. Take it boiled and take it down our throat. We don't know if there's cream and sugar in there, but we do know that it probably doesn't feel good. Even if it's cold tea, he's probably gagging on it a little bit there. So that would be another example there. Up here, we're going to find throughout the colonies, especially as you got further north, especially up in Boston, you were going to find lots of nooses hanging from trees. And oftentimes there were effigies hanging in those nooses, which of course were lookalikes or kind of like dummies of tax collectors that were thrown up there in the noose and oftentimes set on fire. Oftentimes people beat them with sticks, but certainly the symbolism was clear. We don't want you here. If you stay, if you try to collect our taxes, there will be consequences. The next one, and this is kind of an interesting one because there really was only one major Boston Tea Party, and whether the artist here or the drawer, whoever created this rendition here, meant to represent the Boston Tea Party in the background or not, that's kind of what's going on back there. And we're going to argue later on whether that Boston Tea Party, from what you know of it, was violent or nonviolent. No one dies in the Boston Tea Party, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was nonviolent. So that's kind of our typical violent response. We think of tax collectors being beat on the street, being killed in a lot of situations, the colonists not being happy with the king's soldiers being sent over, and so then the colonists respond by doing violent acts like the Boston Massacre. But more times than not, the responses or the protests started with nonviolent approaches. And again, the biggest tactic that the colonies had, or the most successful tactic they had, was spreading rumors word of mouth. Not even rumors, true stories as well. There were stories of, listen to what the British did, or did you hear how the king came and fired, 2,000 tea merchants just because he wanted to pass the Tea Act, or something like that. There were all these stories that were being passed around, and these are I don't know, that picture is kind of funny, but these are going to be the ways in which most colonists are able to at least convince colonists, loyalists in a lot of cases, to join the patriot cause. Because the American Revolution can't happen if there's only a handful of patriots, there's only a handful of disgruntled colonists. There needs to be a large majority. And so that's where these word of mouth stories and newspaper articles and people writing letters, that's where the damage actually started coming in. It wasn't that they were hurting the king or England with these stories, but they were certainly gaining membership to their cause, to the patriot cause. The next thing I want to point out, though, and these are probably the most, it looks like the petitions are getting cut off. I'll tell you what it says down there. But the second and third most effective forms of nonviolent protests were boycotts, which of course was not buying something that the king or England was selling, and petitions, formally writing down your grievances and having people sign it. Now, in the case of the king, petitions didn't always work all that well, and I'll tell you why. If you were to write a petition to the king and say, we don't like your stupid laws, or we think your laws are silly or frivolous or shouldn't be applied to us, if you write that down and then you have 1 million people sign it, even if they're British citizens, even if they live in England, even if they're influential and famous or wealthy people, it doesn't matter to the king, and for one simple reason. The king doesn't have to get reelected. And the king, it doesn't really matter if the citizens of England like the king or not, because he's not coming up for reelection. Unfortunately for our presidents and our representatives here in the United States, fortunately for us, but unfortunately for them in some cases, they do have to come up for reelection every couple of years. And so they have to make sure we're happy. So if the president gets a petition that's signed by 1 million people and they're all voters, he's got to be real careful with how he handles that petition. If he just tears it up and ignores it, those people don't vote for him, he or she doesn't get reelected. In the king's case, he can tear it up and it doesn't necessarily matter. It just makes angry colonists, and the angry colonists, well, they're just angry unless they take it to the next step, which of course they do. But the boycotts, this is an interesting one. I mentioned this in a previous screencast, that the colonists were a major financial benefit to England, to the mother country. England was hugely benefiting financially from the colonies, from the tobacco they sold to any of the cash crops, from wheat, indigo, across the board, corn, you name it. The colonists were growing it, and the citizens of England were benefiting from it. So when we talk about boycotts, this is going to be a fairly successful nonviolent protest. The biggest one was tea. We talk about in the 1780s and even into the 1770s, there were over 1 million drinkers of tea that were drinking tea twice a day. So colonists, huge numbers of colonists were going out and they were drinking tea. Well, they needed to buy it from somewhere. They couldn't grow it in America, and so they were buying it from England at a pretty hefty price. So all of that tea was coming in, and as you guys know, tea time is still a very important aspect of British life, and you still hear the Queen of England taking her tea time and all that stuff. It was a big deal back then as well. People associated, it was part of their culture. They associated with the tea. And so when tea was taxed, many of the colonists decided that they were going to boycott anything that was taxed, and that included tea. So they started to come up with alternatives. They didn't stop drinking tea. They just stopped drinking British tea. They started drinking coffee. They started drinking Liberty tea, which was raspberry leaves that were ground up and put into boiling water. And apparently they tasted terrible, but the idea was that the colonists said, it's a sacrifice we're willing to make. Much of this was thanks to the Daughters of Liberty, a group I'll talk about in a minute. But this group of ladies that typically were in charge of the taverns and restaurants, they were the ones that were buying tea in large quantities. They stopped buying tea, and they stopped even putting it on the menu. So if you went to a local tavern, you didn't have the option to buy British tea. All they had was coffee and Liberty tea. So even if you weren't like a staunch opponent of the British and you said, oh, I'm going to still drink my tea, you drank it in your own private residency. You didn't drink it out in public because it wasn't being offered. All right, this is going to lead to a group called the Committee of Correspondence, which is going to be led by the Adamses, John and Sam Adams. They both were going to be major contributors to this group. And the group quite simply was a group of men in Boston that wrote letters to the other colonies letting them know what was going on in Boston, because that's really where a lot of the craziness was going on. It's where a lot of the butting of heads between the colonists and the British was happening. And so the people of Boston would write these letters in groups, and they were well-educated men that wrote this stuff down, and they submitted it to local newspapers in Pennsylvania and in Georgia and in South Carolina, so that those people, remember, there's no TV, there's no cameras, there's no local news that's going to be broadcasting 24 hours a day. You need to get that information from someone who lived it. Now, of course, there's going to be a patriot bias, and that bias, of course, is going to be a slanted view of what actually happened. So if there's a fight that broke out and it was started by a patriot, the Committee of Correspondence may not write that it was started by the patriot. It might just write what actually happened, and it may have, ended with the patriot being shot by a British soldier. Now, you might not ever find out why. You just know that there's a dead patriot, and it was the result of a British soldier. And you might get a feeling of distrust towards the British as a result of it, and it may sway, depending on how it's written, it may sway your opinion on how you feel about the British. So this was a very successful way, again, of winning more people over to the cause. Again, this is the group that's responsible for naming a number of the major events that we talk about today, from the Boston Tea Party. Think about that. From a patriot perspective, the Boston Tea Party, it sounds like something that you'd want to be invited to. Hey, I want to go to the Boston Tea Party, it's a party. Or the Boston Massacre, where only 5 people die. But again, not that there's anything, I'm not making light of 5 people dying, but when I hear the word massacre, I think of thousands of people being murdered and the city being burned to the ground and all that horrible stuff. But the Boston Massacre was something written by the Committee of Correspondence, picked up by local newspapers throughout the colonies, and dubbed the Boston Massacre because of what was written about it in the Committee of Correspondence, not telling the whole story. And of course, the intolerable acts, acts that are intolerable. We cannot tolerate these acts. Even though we dumped the tea in the harbor, the king responded with these punishments, we say they are intolerable. So very, very interesting names, and really we'll talk later about the importance of naming things as well. But that was it. Sorry about that little glitch there. I'm not sure what happened. But colonial protesters, and again, there were many of them. I'm not going to talk about every one of them. I'm just going to hit on a couple of them. I'll bring them both up now. One's a man, one's obviously a woman. Sam Adams is going to be not the beer guy, although I put him up there. And there's an interesting side note maybe I'll tell you in class about why Sam Adams is called Sam Adams, the brewing company Sam Adams. But Sam Adams was a leader of the Sons of Liberty. If the Daughters of Liberty were the women's group that led protests, and many violent, some nonviolent protests, the Sons of Liberty were going to be the male version of that. And they were the ones that gained a lot of press because they started many, many organized protests in the streets of Boston as well as elsewhere throughout the colonies. These were the guys that were going around and throwing rocks through loyalist windows, and these were the guys that were publicly harassing many of the soldiers. And of course their leader is going to be Sam Adams, who wasn't a great public speaker. Again, this is sort of an interesting side note here. He wasn't the guy that stood up and said rah, rah, rah and got them going. He just brought everyone together. He understood politics, he loved politics, and he brought people together knowing that there would be safety in numbers and people would feel confident to speak up if they were in a group rather than by themselves. Mercy Otis Warren, she's an interesting lady as well, not often talked about, but Mercy Otis Warren was a self-educated woman that wrote plays, which in most circumstances would be pretty innocent, but her plays were very satirical. They poked fun at the British. She wrote some doozies. She wrote one called The Adulator, which was about the mayor of Boston, I'm sorry, the governor of Boston at this time, no, the mayor of Boston at this time, a guy named Hutchinson. She wrote another one called The Motley Assembly, The Blockheads. Again, a lot of these plays that she wrote were in direct defiance and in many ways showing insubordination to the British. She made them sound silly, look silly. She made the king look foolish. She made them look mean. And so whether you knew it or not, you'd go to one of her plays and you'd subconsciously be thinking that the British are not nice people. And even if you were a loyalist, you might walk out of it being like, I wonder why the British are such jerks. So she was very effective. Sam Adams actually credits her with really turning the tide of the patriot cause, getting enough women on board as well as men that were kind of on the fence in a real subconscious way without kind of beating them over the head with it. All right, and this of course is the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party that we all think about. But in reality, this is what the Boston Tea Party looked like. It was a group of Bostonians, about 50 of them, that dressed up like Mohawk Indians and jumped on board a British tea ship and just trashed it, dumping about $1 million into the harbor, actually turning Boston into the saltiest and the largest teapot in the world. So what happens here is there's some resentment towards the tax on tea. And there's some angry colonists who want tea but know they can't have it because it's taxed. They want the tax to be repealed, but it's not happening. The king's kind of standing firm on this. So they decide to go on board and dump his tea into the harbor. It's about $1 million worth of tea. The king's not happy with this. He doesn't like the public slap in the face, and he doesn't like the financial loss. So I want to talk to you guys in class, next class, because you can read about it in your book a little bit about what happens. Next class about whether you think this was violent or nonviolent. And I'll leave you looking at this picture here to decide for yourself. It's very Interesting.